Hello, my name is Rachel Sanchez, and I'm a research fellow at Gonville and Keys and an affiliate lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. I'm also one of the conveners of the Reproductive Justice Research Network, alongside Katie Dow, Aideen O'Shaughnessy, Julieta Chaparro, and Sofia Ugarte. Today, we will be talking with Lucy Lowe, lecturer in medical anthropology at the University of Edinburgh. If you have not done so already, please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. And additionally, please do follow us on both Facebook and Twitter at Reproductive Justice Cam. We hope you enjoyed this talk.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am Sofia Ugarte, and together with Rachel Sanchez Rivera, Aideen O'Shaughnessy, Katie Dow, and Julieta Chaparro, we welcome you to the third event of the Reproductive Justice Research Network. And we have a Twitter account and a Facebook group that you're very welcome to join and to follow. And the Reproductive Justice Research Network is supported by the SRI Reproduction, ReproSoc, and Gonville and Keys at the University of Cambridge. And we will be organizing seminars, reading groups, and roundtables throughout this academic year. First, a reminder, this Zoom session will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. So if you don't want to be in the recording, just turn off your camera, and we're asking everyone to keep their microphones muted to avoid any disruptions. And at the Q&A session, we will be reading questions on the chat, but you can also raise your hand function and unmute yourself to ask questions after the presentation. So we are happy to welcome today Dr. Lucy Lowe. She's a lecturer in medical anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, and she previously held the position of director of the Edinburgh Centre for Medical Anthropology. Her research on gender, reproductive health, and forced migration analyzes the relationship between reproductive and migrant justice. Dr. Lucy Lowe is currently working on a research project that investigates the ways in which pregnancy and motherhood impact the experiences among refugee and asylum-seeking women in Scotland, and is also part of a research team that looks at how Somali and Congolese displaced people access mental health care in the context of displacement, conflict, and sexual and gender-based violence. Today, she will be presenting us part of her research on migrant maternity within the UK's hostile environment, with the title Displacement, Maternity, and Reproductive Justice. And following the presentation, we will have time for questions. So if you want to stick around. Thank you, Lucy, for being here and to sharing with us your thoughts and your work. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And a little apology for the slightly late start. That was my fault. I had a little technological meltdown. And just to say that I don't have any PowerPoint today, just my own face for you to look at. I don't know about all of you, but I'm quite often at sort of this time of the day, quite often doing reproductive and domestic labour at the same time as working, and I listen to these kind of seminars while cooking or looking after my kids or taking them to swimming lessons or doing whatever. So if you are doing any of that, know that you are not missing anything if you're not looking at this screen. So I wanted to first of all say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking to all of you today. And quite a few of the names and faces that are popping up, the black boxes with the names are familiar in it, so it's really lovely to have this space for this conversation today. I've spent most of the last several years teaching and having babies and raising babies and homeschooling, and it can make it really difficult to participate in these kind of conversations. And I think that's been like perk doesn't feel like the right word, but perhaps a perk of the pandemic and lockdown is that it's moved so many of these sort of spaces online, and it has made it possible to have these conversations. So it's really nice to be here at the beginning of a new research project, although it's slightly daunting talking about a project I have not yet done, but I'm looking forward to discussing the ideas with all of you. As Sofia mentioned in her introduction, my interest is really in the intersection of reproductive justice and migrant justice, and that has always informed my research, thinking about the ways in which pregnancy and motherhood and reproduction shape experiences of displacement and migration, but also the ways in which these produce ideas about gender and about who is considered a quote-unquote refugee woman, and the particular ideas about being deserving of protection, of care that this entails, and the ways in which these categories are racialized and gendered. This is kind of underpins all of my research. And my previous research project, which I'll just mention briefly because it does inform the current one, and perhaps some of you in this call will have heard about that research for the best part of the decade, so I will keep it brief, but that was in Kenya, mostly with Somali women who could be described as refugees, although they often didn't see themselves in that way. Instead of staying in the refugee camps as are required by the Kenyan refugee encampment policy, which is arguably another hostile environment, in some ways different to our own in the UK, but similarly informed by histories of colonialism and imperialism, and particularly British colonialism and imperialism. So despite this policy, many thousands of refugees live instead of in the camps, they live in urban centres, particularly in Nairobi, where I conducted most of my research. And what became apparent was that their experiences, the processes, the opportunities for migration and livelihoods and so forth were highly gendered. And that perhaps seems fairly obvious. But for women, and I use women here really as an ethnographic term, right? These are, in this context where I was doing my research, there's really highly rigid heteronormative ideas about gender. And the gendering of migration was very much through kinship and reproduction. So although a small number of the women that I was working with worked outside the home, often selling tea or selling clothing, things like that, most of them worked within the home doing domestic labour. They were wives, mothers. Often people would use the term housewives, the English term, often one of the only English terms that they knew. And they survived physically and financially within these informal, sort of somewhat illicit spaces within Nairobi as wives and daughters, and I would say most importantly as mothers, because for these young women that I was working with, marrying, and I would say more importantly, securing that marriage through producing children, producing multiple children, meant that women were creating their own networks of support, not only locally within Nairobi or within Kenya, but they were often embedding themselves in transnational networks that could provide both crucial financial support. People were generally heavily dependent on remittances sent from abroad. But this also opened up possibilities for onward migration through family reunification or sort of other migratory processes, obtaining visas, things like that. And what I was particularly interested in was the ways in which women and their families were making reproductive and marital decisions, particularly reproductive decisions, though, within this context of a precarious and often hostile environment and their limited opportunities for onward migration. And I've written about this in various places, so I won't go on about it too much, and I'm happy to discuss it during the Q&A, but women were often primarily concerned with protecting their long-term fertility and their capacity to produce children. So it was seen as ideal for these women that I was working with to be having babies quickly. So generally didn't use contraceptives, often didn't breastfeed or didn't breastfeed for very long because it was seen as inhibiting their ability to get pregnant again. Although in some cases for women who were perhaps still considered daughters, right? They weren't married, they wanted to be considered, or they were married, but they still wanted to be considered daughters with and sort of attached to their own parents' opportunities for resettlement. They might use contraceptives because they were worried if they became parents themselves, that would nullify their position of daughter within the eyes of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or whichever one of the organizations or governments was facilitating that resettlement. And what I've written about most extensively is the rejection of C-sections, caesarean sections among birthing women, because it was widely perceived that to have a C-section would limit the possibility for future pregnancies, or would limit the number of pregnancies that, you know, that if your security is in your capacity to produce more children, then the sort of the threat of an intervention that is going to limit your fertility is clearly something threatening. But importantly, ideas about motherhood and kinship more broadly were also central to the policies and practices surrounding international humanitarianism and displacement. Mothers and their children were a prioritised group for resettlement, and they were really at the opposite end of the spectrum from single men that many countries refused to accept to be resettled. There was some discussion while I was doing my research that women who were infertile, it was framed as infertile as a result of sexual violence. How one proves that is complicated and another matter, but this idea that women who were incapable of becoming mothers for this reason should be resettled. And there are certain assumptions there about what it means to live a quality life without children, and within different contexts, right? And broader than that, also looking at family reunification processes, right? They involve proving kinship through DNA testing, in particular ideas about blood and that being crucial for proving kinship, right? And then if you Google, these are my excellent researcher techniques, right? If you Google refugee women, you're presented with images of women grasping onto children, often in this very sort of Madonna and childlike image. That is, if you just go into the images, that is the thing that comes up over and over again, right? This persistent idea that to be a refugee woman means to be a woman clutching a child, right? This image of vulnerability, of deservingness, of neediness, something Laura Briggs has written about extensively, not specifically about refugees, but about the power of that image. Now, in Europe, pregnancy and elsewhere, pregnancy is a frequent outcome of the high rates of sexual violence experienced by women migrants crossing the Mediterranean, crossing across the Americas into the United States, in all places where there's forced migration and displacement, we see this. However, the dual perspective of women refugees as victims of sexual violence on the one hand and as mothers has fostered this homogenous category of woman in humanitarian contexts. The persecution experienced by women is often associated with the private domestic sphere, and therefore it's often beyond the remit of asylum claims, which assume a masculine victim of persecution with political violence situated in the public sphere. Gender-based claims to asylum are often grounded in women's social and reproductive role. They're often related to honour killings, to domestic violence, to FGM. And in asylum cases, the ideology of women as mothers, or women with the potential to be mothers, can be more powerful than other claims to women's rights. Pregnant immigrants can receive exceptional treatment, such as access to medical care or temporary residence that would otherwise be denied. And in the UK, pregnant women can, on paper, not in practice, but in paper, only be detained in immigration facilities for a maximum of 3 days. And asylum-seeking women, including those with refused claims, are entitled to additional forms of support. And there are differences across Scotland and England and Wales here. This heightened state of empathy for immigrants who are deemed to be vulnerable and in need of special protection produces a hierarchy of deservingness. And in the refugee woman as a category, we see deservingness grounded in the racialized, gendered, reproductive body. And while my previous research only really included cis hetero women, or those who were able to pass as such, right? In this particular area where I was working, it's Eastleigh, Little Mogadishu, it's got a dense Somali diaspora enclave, and there was pretty widespread persecution of sort of LGBT communities, so they tended to not live within that area, right? They would live within different parts of the city. For that reason, right, my research didn't really include the experience of trans or non-binary folk who are evidently going to be affected by international migratory regimes that essentialize women as mothers, or at least those with a perceived capacity to gestate. And in Kenya, I was working almost exclusively with Somali women and their families who mostly paid for private medical care. And this gave them a particular relationship as not just patients, but also valued customers who were able to pick and choose the interventions and therapies they wanted where they could afford them. And I wondered what might these decisions look like in the UK, where maternity care is largely provided by the NHS. And there are sort of basic, calling them forms of support, particularly financial support, is dubious when you're talking about the UK, but there are forms of social support for asylum seekers, those seeking asylum, and those who've been granted some form of leave to remain. So global metrics highlight that 99% of all maternal deaths occur in developing countries, and that most are caused by preventable and treatable conditions. But this narrative really obscures the significant maternal health inequalities that are evident within countries. Women in high-income countries are more likely to receive regular access to skilled health workers. However, the domestic stratification of maternal mortality and morbidity indicates complex and overlapping social, economic, and political obstacles to quality healthcare and positive reproductive experiences. And we know this if we look at the recent Embrace report that just came out that shows that Black women are still 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy than white women, and Asian women are 2 times more likely within the UK, although of course the data collection around these is highly problematic. And we know that refugee and asylum seeking women in the UK are at risk of poor pregnancy and birth outcomes, but again, the data that is collected around these groups is again problematic. And research suggests that there are between 6,000 and 10,000 asylum-seeking women in Scotland, while the number of women who've been granted refugee status or other forms of humanitarian protection is unknown. Yet very little is known about their reproductive experiences or how it can shape their capacity to navigate asylum processes. And so my new project really aims to make maternal health in refugee and asylum-seeking communities an issue of reproductive justice, contributing to the international challenge of ensuring reproductive and maternal health for displaced people. Surveillance and management are defining characteristics of both pregnancy care and immigration in the UK, in quite interesting ways that are similar and also very, very different to Kenya in my previous research. But in the UK, both pregnancy and immigration surveillance require their subjects to undertake forms of self-discipline and reporting, making themselves visible to the state. Both modes of surveillance are arguably intended to protect citizens, current and future, from the perceived risks of immigration and pregnancy. However, these modes of surveillance and management are underscored by very different categories of risk. In the case of pregnancy, antenatal services and monitoring are provided by the NHS. The value of skilled care during pregnancy, childbirth, and the perinatal period is widely cited as essential to minimise the physical risk of maternal and infant death or injury. The routine use of tests, scans, and maternal and fetal monitoring and interventions illustrate the high-skilled medical supervision that pregnancy in the UK entails. And I think it's interesting to think here about the ideas about control and care and what care looks like, and to what extent do we understand care and the provision of care being about tests and scans and monitoring and so forth, right? This medicalization of reproduction perceives the pregnant body as inherently risky and in need of surveillance and management, with immigrant women's bodies often perceived as the most unruly. And this is drawing on Kiara Bridges' work around pregnancy as a site of racialization. And so in this new project, which I've just begun, I'm trying to examine pregnancy not as this terrible thing that just happens to women, right? Which is often how it's presented, or this challenge that women face. But instead try and understand pregnancy as a routine part of forced migration and asylum, because pregnancies in all sorts of forms, they continue, right? We know that. Pregnancy is usually presented as an additional challenge and a source of vulnerability for asylum-seeking and refugee women. Their experiences of pregnancy are frequently complicated by health problems, including poor nutrition, mental health problems, and infectious disease. Forced relocation via the dispersal policy in the UK and the restrictions imposed by the Home Office, support for asylum seekers can have damaging effects on the health of women and their children, and that's something that we've seen more of. The dispersal policy that sort of relocates people seeking asylum to different parts of the UK is the impact of this as well during COVID, when people have been locked down in communities where they don't know anybody. That has been exacerbated. And asylum seekers also often experience a deterioration in health during the first 2 or 3 years in the UK. Poverty, destitution, homelessness and language are key barriers to accessing quality antenatal care. And the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, the NICE or not so nice sometimes, has emphasised the impact of social disadvantage on maternal health and pregnancy outcomes. It classifies refugee and asylum-seeking women's pregnancies as high risk due to the complex social factors they face, and recommends increased efforts to improve access and engagement with maternity services. And again, thinking about what do these increased efforts look like, the recent draft guidelines was for people, including all Black and brown women who are perceived to be at high risk, was to have inductions at 38 weeks, right? And thankfully they've moved away from that recommendation, but thinking critically about what forms care might take and why. So research on forced migrants frequently emphasises the violent state exclusion of refugees, yet reproduction presents a potential zone of inclusion, I think, where women and their infants are rendered deserving of protection on the basis of motherhood rather than persecution, caught in this kind of paradox of compassion and oppression. And in this project, I'll be examining the ways in which women's claims to asylum and their I live near a hospital. In which women's claims to asylum and the exceptional zones of inclusion are grounded in a reproductive politics that values and defines women by their reproductive capacities. Motherhood, like the biological body, is perceived as apolitical and deserving of protection and inclusion. Pregnancy and motherhood may be a source of vulnerability, but can this vulnerability be mobilised in ways that enable women to navigate asylum claims and settlement, similar to what I found in Kenya? And rather than assuming pregnancy is an exclusively positive or negative experience, this project will be open to complex experiences of reproduction. Pregnancy and motherhood can allow refugee women to form networks of social and familial support, but the financial, physical and emotional demands of raising children can risk further isolating marginalised women and exacerbating mental health conditions that are already more prevalent among refugees and asylum seekers. Literature often focuses exclusively on pregnant women and mothers and doesn't engage with broader relationships, including fathers or other family members. This project addresses this gap, moving away from a perception of pregnancy as a social and medical problem, and instead seeks to understand how pregnancy and motherhood shapes their personal and institutional relationships and their experiences of claiming asylum and settling in Scotland. The rhetoric of the UK's hostile environment frames immigrants, particularly those categorised as unskilled or undocumented, as risks to be minimised and controlled. And when I'm talking about the hostile environment in the UK, it's not just about this particular moment and the introduction of these policies under the Conservative government, although they stem from the new Labour government. In the UK, the hostile environment has a much longer history, as I mentioned, within thinking about the UK, how it understands itself in relation to the world, and histories of colonialism and imperialism. And it's important, I think, to situate them within that rather than thinking of something exceptional happening at this current point in time. That said, this hostility was echoed by elements of the Brexit campaign that claimed that immigration is damaging to national security, identity, and economic prosperity. Power over immigration is reserved to the UK government, which is something that the Scottish government like to frequently remind people while continuing with their rhetoric that inclusively praises immigrants for their economic and cultural contribution. The Scottish Government launched the first New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy in 2013, and the second phase, covering 2018 to 2022, is currently underway. The vision for this strategy is for, quote, a welcoming Scotland where refugees and asylum seekers are able to rebuild their lives from the day they arrive, end quote. Now, I personally think that sounds wonderful, but I think it's important to be wary of rhetoric that feeds into this idea of Scottish exceptionalism, sort of form of Scottish hospitality, and particularly ideas that there's no racism, really popular ideas that there's no racism in Scotland, which has been written about by Neil Davidson, the late great Neil Davidson, and others in their edited volume, No Problem Here. These are really persistent ideas in discourses around Scotland and Scottish nationalism that it's very important to critique. So this project will interrogate the relationship between borders. This project's promising quite a lot, isn't it? Anyway, the relationship between borders, citizenship, immigration controls, and reproduction within the uneven and fluctuating political and legislative UK landscape. Over the past decade, the deaths of people trying to enter Europe via the Mediterranean and the UK via the Channel have become a spectacle of the violence of migration, the hierarchies of citizenship, and forms of biopolitical exclusion. Attempts to understand the racialised management and exclusion of irregular migrants in Europe and beyond have been situated within a biopolitical or even necropolitical framework. By contrast, the lives of pregnant migrants have gone relatively unexamined, yet reproduction has been described as a biopolitical space par excellence because it draws together individual and collective concerns, private and public politics, new technologies, legislation and ethics. Reproduction and motherhood also reproduction and motherhood are, as we know, they're about more than just, these moments of pregnancy and birth, although they often end up being the focus of research and of other spaces of conversation about refugee mothers. But we know that they go beyond that, and that's using a reproductive justice framework kind of emphasises that, and exploring the ways in which reproduction produces new social and political relationships and new forms of inclusion and exclusion. And so a focus on reproductive politics and reproductive justice allows for a gendered analysis of immigration and asylum that recognises the implications of the veneration and stratification of pregnancy and motherhood. Now, the capacity to gain citizenship or residency through births situates reproductive politics within anti-immigration anxieties. The babies born to asylum-seeking women in the UK cannot help their parents' claims to residence, but they can transform encounters with the state and their host community. The use of institutions such as hospitals and schools as immigration monitors has been heavily critiqued for diffusing the hostile environment to all aspects of daily life, which is the point of the hostile environment, right? Yet the British Red Cross have reported generally positive experiences with the NHS midwives in Glasgow, where this research is going to be conducted, who often advise women on additional avenues for support. I should have said Glasgow is the only dispersal site in Scotland, so all asylum seekers who are being dispersed to the UK, they're all in Glasgow, right? So these strong relationships between medical professionals and third sector organisations in providing support for asylum seeking and refugee women illuminates the ways in which individuals who regularly work with these populations navigate their professional obligations to their patients and their employers. NHS Scotland provision of maternity care differs from the NHS in England and Wales, but both use the same indicators for so-called safe, effective and women-centred care. Beyond medical care, in 2017, the Scottish Government launched the Baby Box scheme, which provides every baby born in Scotland, regardless of immigration status, with clothes, toys, a sling, changing mat, books, bedding, and a room and bath thermometers, presented in a box which doubles as a bed for the baby. So again, thinking about these forms of care and this idea of sort of Scottish hospitality. So this is much about reproductive justice within the UK, within Brexit Britain, and within Scotland. Scotland, whether or not it's on the verge of becoming independent, always seems to think it's on the verge of becoming independent. So before we open up this discussion, I want to say something about methods for this project. During my previous research, I spent a lot of time with women discussing their hopes and plans for their pregnancies, their births and beyond, walking up and down flights of stairs in an effort to naturally encourage labour to start or hurry up a bit. I spent a lot of time massaging backs and holding hands. I made sure that people had the drinks and the food that they wanted, right? What I didn't realize at the time was that this work, this birth work, is what a doula does. This was my own ignorance, right? To me, and my idea of what a doula was this kind of wishy-washy figure that affluent upper middle class women in Edinburgh hire as this like badge of honor of their, I don't know, natural birth credentials, right? It never occurred to me, certainly, during my own pregnancies that I would want or need a doula, but my God, I wish it had. And when I started doing sort of scoping research for this new project, I encountered some incredible doulas in Glasgow who were providing their services to asylum-seeking and refugee pregnant people for free. And these are people who often didn't have anyone else to be with them during their birth, or to go to appointments with them and so forth, right? And by the time I was finally putting my grant application together, it's a very long, arduous process, a new organisation, AMA Birth Companions, had formed who were doing this work of training and providing doulas for asylum seekers and refugees. And AMA joins a plethora of organisations which exist to advise, support and advocate for refugees and asylum seekers. And medical research has indicated that the support of doulas can have positive outcomes, including a decreased need for medical interventions and an increase in maternal satisfaction. However, this research is really narrowly, certainly the research that I've come across, so please let me know if you've encountered others, but a lot of this research is quite narrowly focused on the white upper middle class women who I certainly associate with doulas, right? And although it has certainly set off alarm bells in some ethics committees, I'm keen to explore how doulaing as method might inform ethnographic research. In this past summer, I began doula training with Mars Lord, who runs Abuela Doulas, which is the first Black-owned, founded and created doula course in the UK. In her course, Mars goes deep into the importance and ways of holding space for people during and after their pregnancies and births, and the ways in which we mentally and emotionally support ourselves and those around us. It occurred to me during this training that I wish I'd had it as a doctoral student. I can't imagine how much it would have transformed my project and what it might have looked like and what it might have been like for the people I was working with. For those of us who do this kind of ethnographic research, doing this doula training has really made me think even more about how we ensure that our presence, particularly during births and after births and during pregnancy, how it's both welcome and ethical. And so I invite the question for all of you, what a reproductive justice approach to ethnography might look like. And I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that amazing presentation and very insightful. Of course, I have a lot of questions myself, but I'm going to open up for other people to make comments or questions. Remember that you can write them in the chat and I can read them out, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask Lucy directly. Yeah, so I don't know if people want to just jump in, or I can just ask myself. I have a lot of things to say. Let's just wait for me. Okay, Gwyneth, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It was really, really interesting and excellent presentation. I'm particularly interested because I think that you're correct, obviously, that migrant mothers and pregnant migrants are depicted as deserving. If you look at the debate around NHS charging, they've been depicted in media as a group that are particularly wrong, hard done by this, as opposed to say people who've been denied cancer treatment. But at the same time, a lot of the government policy on NHS charging specifically singles out pregnant migrants as a group for whom all use of the NHS is illicit. So even though in theory, they're supposed to be targeting so-called maternity tourism, which they also acknowledge doesn't necessarily really exist. In their own documents, there's a significant slippage between maternity tourism and literally any pregnant migrant whatsoever. And I was just wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I find it really fascinating. So in Kenya, there was a lot, like in the media, about sort of this idea of Somali hyperfertility, and this idea that I'm really similar to what you hear in the UK about immigrants. They're all going to come here and have babies and like outbreed us all, like this kind of nationalist rhetoric that we encounter in all sorts of places, right? But the difference there wasn't a sense that they were kind of sort of scroungers, would be the word you would hear in the UK, right? They weren't, because they were mostly paying for services. Although refugees in general, there was a sense that they were kind of taking something. But in the UK, absolutely, I think that it's even clearer here that we have this idea, and this is what I find really interesting, is this idea that, oh, we women and their babies, and they're pregnant, and we have to protect them, and we have to look after them, because that's what you do for women, right? Pregnant women, mothers, have this special entitlement. But at the same time, that you're right, that it never goes away, this idea that immigrants are dangerous, racialized as Black and brown immigrants are particularly dangerous, and that and this idea that reproduction is a way in which sort of they are claiming space, claiming resources. So absolutely, we see this. I mean, this is sort of what I find the most interesting thing about this project in the UK right now, this idea, this simultaneous idea of deservingness and the threat of them, that they cost something, but also with the rise of particular forms of nationalism within the UK and Europe more broadly, and the world more, fascism, the world more broadly, that this particular anxiety around reproductive immigrants is really salient. So it's this tension that I'm really interested in. That doesn't really answer your question. I'm just like, yeah, I agree.
That's fine. I'm doing a research project on migrant women's experiences in maternity care in 3 areas in the north of England. And
let's be in touch.
Yes, we should be. Although and that's just something I've noticed. But yeah, we should definitely be in touch. That would be great.
Which areas of the north of England? Just out of curiosity.
Manchester, Leeds, and Kirklees. Basically, for social reproduction reasons, I planned it around where I live. So, because pre-COVID, I assumed everything would have to be done in person, which that didn't happen. But
yeah, and the north of England, I was at a conference last week that was organised by Mars Lord, who I mentioned, who did the doula training, and the Association of South Asian Midwives. And a lot of what they were talking about was a racism, and a lot of them were based in the north of England. So the relationship between, or racism within the NHS in that area is super interesting. Yes, let's talk more.
Aideen?
Hi, thank you, Lucy, so much for your presentation. There was a lot of things that I was thinking about, and I think Gwyneth has just kind of hit on one of those topics, which was around this idea of migrant women's childbearing as somehow being kind of a threat to like national identity. I think that discourse was very strong, particularly in Ireland in the early 2000s. This whole idea of like anchor babies, and it went so far as to like actually the laws around citizenship were changed in Ireland, which is, it's widely perceived that that was a direct result of kind of the influx of migration during that period. But what I wanted to actually ask you about was about what the kind of services or experiences tend to be for asylum seeking people or refugees seeking like abortion or termination services? Because I know that you said that, you know, a lot of these kind of move towards inclusion are grounded on the fact of like their inclusion being grounded on their motherhood or their reproduction. And I'm wondering how these categories of like risk and vulnerability do or do not kind of operate in relation to like the termination of pregnancy or abortion services for the same group of people.
Thank you. Yeah. Another great question. And of course, the Pregnant on Arrival is a great book, of course, about thinking about the Irish context. And of course, in Scotland, the difference being that, there would be no claims for citizenship. So the idea of, I mean, even though we still have this sort of almost an idea of an anchor baby, like having a baby gives you particular claims, legally it doesn't within Scotland. And I think that what's interesting about Scotland is this, so in Scotland, health is devolved to the Scottish government, so they have control there, but immigration isn't, and they talk about it at every given opportunity, that, you know, this sort of, the rhetoric is almost like, oh, if Scotland was independent, we'd let everyone come, it would be this like asylum utopia, we'd let everybody in and everyone would have the support they need, which who knows, right? Because they don't have any control over immigration, so it's easy to make those claims. But that being said, there are certain services like the maternal health care that is provided for free, even to refused asylum seekers, which isn't in England. So there are certain differences between Scotland and England. And now I've forgotten your question, and I feel like I've gone completely off piste.
You're fine. It's my fault because I asked you two questions in one, basically. My question was around, like, if in your own research or if in this project, about abortion services for asylum and refugee seeking people.
Sorry, I got so caught up in my own thinking about Pregnant on Arrival. So abortion, that is, I don't know yet, because but it is something I'm really interested in, because speaking to researchers who work in other parts of Europe, I've heard about certain assumption, particularly around African women as reproducers. You know, this particular idea that African women are like naturally reproductive, sort of hyper reproductive, hypersexual, hyper fertile, and that certain assumptions are made about the provision of abortion and abortion care, but also the implications of that for seeking asylum, right? So if from other researchers not working in the UK, working in other parts of Europe, this idea that you know, they've encountered Italian women, encountered African women who have been seeking asylum but have sought an abortion upon arrival, and then this has been used against them almost, like, because it's questionable. It's, you know, if they're supposed to be this good deserving mother and they're seeking an abortion, they can't be trusted, right? So that's absolutely something I'm interested. I'll get back to you on that one.
So we don't have any questions in the chat yet, so I invite you to pop in the chat to just ask or comment. For now, we only have comments of praise and interest in people who actually need to run and leave the Zoom because they need to take care of their kids, such as swimming, school run, and so on. So before anybody else raises their hand, I'm going to use the opportunity, the window. I really like your talk too. I think it's fascinating. I've been following your work for a while too, because I also work with migrant women in South America who also become mothers, interestingly enough. And I have a question about what you were talking about particularly in your research or what you know so far, about the role of social workers and midwives, to think about them, say, as complex bridges between kind of policies of hostile environment and the refugee experience in the host country. And I think how that complex bridge between these two kind of opposing realities or kind of antagonist elements can allow us to think of their role, kind of midwives and social workers and doulas and so on, in mobilizing a particular form of reproductive justice within this political setting that is quite particular to the UK.
Thank you. Yeah, the role of midwives, first of all, I find interesting because I've read so much in the UK about negative experiences in midwifery care for all sorts of reasons, whether it's been about, you know, this kind of the hostile environment of them, the document checking of, you know, thinking that they have to pay, or just generally negative kind of experiencing racism, being undermined, not being listened to, not taken seriously, not being given pain relief when it's requested. You know, so much. I'm sure people on this call will be familiar with these problems. So that's why I was quite interested in to hear so many positive accounts of midwifery within Glasgow. Not universally positive, but a lot of positivity around midwifery in Glasgow. And like a lot of it's hearing the same names, the individuals' names over and over again. And within Glasgow, they have a specific a specific midwifery team for asylum seekers, right? So, and I don't know if that is the same across England and Wales. I don't know, and what role that might play. But that is something. So, and hearing time and time again how important that, and this extra labour that midwives are doing beyond their job as midwives, they're helping connect these women to various other services and forms of support and so forth, right? So that's absolutely interesting. And also thinking about the sort of formal relationships and institutional relationships that people form when they're seeking asylum, right? The actual asylum process is, of course, horrendous. And, you know, the experience of having to do those interviews, and people are generally treated very poorly. And so I'm also interested that the experiences that people have with midwives, this kind of somewhat regular contact with someone who's providing some form of state service, who isn't, you know, who isn't part of the asylum system, and how people actually perceive that is something that I'm really keen to explore. And then, of course, the difference between community midwives and the actual, you know, for those of who are giving birth in hospitals, which most of them are, all of them, most people are, you know, if the relationships are the same within hospitals and how that might be different within birth, during birth. Social workers, I have read less about, certainly within Scotland, although yeah, I'd be interested to find out about social workers. It's certainly something that's discussed less within the Scottish context, but I would be very interested to find out more.
Thank you. Anybody else has questions for Lucy? Want to unmute yourself or raise your hand? I can jump in again because I have another question. Oh, Julieta, yes.
Thanks, Lucy, for such a fantastic and really illuminating presentation, especially for the case in Scotland, which is less known in comparison to the US, for example, that really produces a lot of news around immigrant women. So I have two questions for you. I would like to ask you, because I noticed that you oscillate between two categories, refugee and migrant. And I would like to know what are the implications for the use of these two different categories in the case for migrant women and the settlement process, because I think that these two categories have different implications or carry different meanings, and also have a different political balance in the process of migration. So I would like to know more a little on that and the use of those categories. And the second one is a question about based on the experiences of migrant women in the US, who we know experience a continuum of violences, from sexual violence to other forms of reproductive violence. Is there something that happens as well to women in the UK? And if maybe you can tell us a little bit more of that, and how can we think about this continuum of women migrating from, in the case mostly from Africa into Europe? Thanks.
Thank you. Good questions. I have a PhD student who is writing about dispersal, and when she goes between migrant and refugee and asylum seeker and undocumented, I'm like, be more specific. So thank you for doing the same to me. In this research project, I'm particularly interested in people who have been through or are going through or might go through the asylum process in the UK. So I am fuzzy in my use of the words, and I know, and perhaps this comes from my previous research where I was working with refugee women who got really angry if you ever referred to them as refugees, even if they had sort of UNHCR documents, and they'd be like, I'm not a refugee, I don't live in a camp. And so kind of defaulted often to referring to them as migrant, but of course there are implications, right? And then there's these ideas of deservingness. Are we perpetuating them by saying, oh, well, let me insist on calling them a refugee though, because it's sort of flagging them as somewhat different, as somewhat more special, as somewhat more deserving, right? Because they have this different, not whether they have that official status of a refugee or not. It flags them in a particular way. Katie Long has a really interesting paper about when refugees stopped being migrants, I think is the title of the paper. And I think that is useful for thinking with about this idea of why do we call particular attention to people because they've been through an asylum process, or perhaps because we might use some broad definition of refugees to label them in such a way. But my intention, methodologically, my intention is not to police anyone's status. I'm not going to be checking. I'm not asking people to prove their status, right? Whether they're an asylum seeker or a refugee or what have you. So I think that's what informs my tendency to move a little bit and perhaps to trouble this distinction between migrants and refugees, and to trouble this idea that they are a distinct category. And I'm certainly within Scotland, there's a lot of trafficked women, and so if they have not claimed asylum, would I still include them in my research if they were going to, right? Would we consider them migrant? Are they still migrants if they're trafficked? So these are, I think, important questions to think through during the research. But certainly my interest is in asylum because of the particular category that it puts people within, in their detainability, their deportability, this sort of this particular precarious context, but then also refugees, right? Because I'm interested in, is this something specific to being within the asylum system? Is this different for people if they've been given indefinite leave to remain within the UK? Do things suddenly change? I mean, their entitlements to forms of social support, social security change, but does that change their experiences of reproduction, of motherhood, right? And then thinking about violence. Could you expand a little bit more on what you were asking about? If there's about the...
Yeah, no, I was thinking more about the news that came out from the US about migrant women being sterilized in detention centers.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or migrant women, that this is something that you already touched on, the denial of abortion, and how these two can be seen as a forms of punishment against migrant women, but also women who migrate from Central American countries, and the whole continuum of violence they experience on the journey, from sexual violence and other forms of violence as well. So I was thinking about that itinerary, that itinerary. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see similar continuums of violence. Perhaps forced sterilizations I've not heard of, but certainly I suspect around long-lasting contraceptives, long-acting contraceptives, and the encouragement of those among certain populations within the UK. And I'm definitely interested to find out, but I suspect asylum seekers and refugees will be amongst those categories. And I'll be interested to find out what the reception of those is. They are strongly promoted within NHS Scotland anyway, but particularly among marginalised groups, right? So absolutely we see that. And then, there's other forms of violence as well. I mean, the asylum system in the UK is a form of violence. The accommodation that they are in Glasgow, there's a mother and baby unit that is completely inappropriate to be keeping people full stop in, but particularly people with small babies. And yes, of course, there are all, and I don't think there are some things here that are specific to asylum seekers and refugees, but actually I think this is a broader challenges, broader continuums of violence that are experienced by immigrants within the UK, but more broadly, sort of racial violence of various forms within the UK and within Scotland, more specifically.
Thank you.
So anybody else has any comments or questions for Lucy? You can raise your hand and unmute yourself, or maybe write your question in the chat.
I have a question.
Yes, I do.
Well, I'm gonna just throw your question back to you, Lucy, because during the presentation you talked about methodology. And I wanted to know, I think if I can find where I took a note of the question, was your question about an ethnography of reproductive justice, or what that would look like? So I'm just wondering what your own thoughts are on that, I suppose.
They are a muddled mess. I've been thinking, working on reproduction and forced migration, spend quite a lot of time thinking about ethics, as one might imagine. And also that where I am in this current research project is deep in dealing with NHS ethics. And in Scotland, we have this, I think this is different from in England, we have to get sponsorship from your university. I don't know if this is, anyway, it's this whole bureaucratic process of ethics that to me doesn't get to the actual ethical challenges of this kind of research. And I think I think a lot about the people that I've been with during their pregnancies and during their births. And when I did my doctoral research, I didn't have any kids, and now I have two. And thinking about what that experience was like for me in Edinburgh in a very different context, but thinking about things like the importance of support, particularly during birth, during labour, and what it means when you're a researcher present for that kind of experience, right? And when you develop, what does informed consent look like when you can see a head crowning, right? It's quite a so as you can see, I'm muddled very much in this, and I found doula training really incredible and made me think about my research in all sorts of new ways. And I've been speaking a lot to Dana Ian Davis, who has the author of the brilliant book Reproductive Justice, who is also a doula, and just seems to effortlessly balance being a professor and a doula at the same time. And she's like, I just manage my time well. Wow, cool, good. But just thinking about our responsibilities and our solidarity with our participants. What are we doing as researchers? Basically, what I want to know is, what are we doing? Why are we there? It's particularly in these moments that people often need people there. And what if you're the only person there? If anyone wants to discuss these rambling things with me more, please get in touch. I'm hoping Dana and Mars are going to come to Edinburgh next year for a workshop on these. So I hope you can join.
Yeah. So actually, Dana and Davis was going to speak this term, but due to strike action, we decided to move the event for March. Yeah, just a quick announcement, just because you mentioned her. So the next event that was with Dana and Davis is now moved to March in support of the UCU strike action. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So I have another question too, and I'm sorry to just maybe monopolize the conversation a bit, but so you speak a lot about deservingness, about the concept of deservingness, and when I think about justice or reproductive justice, the way it is also phrased in general is in terms of right, the right to this and that, and it has to do a lot about entitlement. And I wonder if within your work, like previous work or now in your own your current research, if that contrast between deservingness and entitlement kind of materializes within the everyday lives of the people you're beginning to contact for your research. Because I think when I think about justice and rights, and it's a lot about kind of fighting for something instead of just passively being the deserving subject because of as a subject of suffering, basically, as a mother. Yeah.
Great question. First of all, I would say that I don't think deservingness and being read as deserving is passive, right? I think it's a lot of work to fit into that category of deservingness, and people know it, and a huge amount of energy is put into being read in that way, and yeah, absolutely, I see it as like a filler that's completely unreliable, in that thinking about the women that I've worked with before who are having babies because they are seen to be within their own families as they deserve support, they've been good wives, they've produced all these babies, they deserve to be supported within their families, but plenty of them I know that have just been effectively abandoned, right, when their husbands have moved abroad or have already been abroad, and then they're not provided with any support, and that's how they describe themselves. They've just been left behind to fend for themselves, and so there is no sense of rights there. There's no sense of justice. There's no avenue for appeal. There's no way to fight that, right? And then thinking about it in a more sort of formal institutional sense, well, it kind of goes back to that question about abortion, right? About how easy it is to slip in and out of these categories of being deserving. Well, if you're seeking an abortion, then you're not the deserving woman that we thought you were, right? So it's much more what's the word? It's intangible, right? Deservingness. And not that justice is always, and rights are easy to claim or easy to access. I think they don't rely on the benevolence of particular. Well, they often do rely on the benevolence of particular paternalistic actors, but in different ways, right? This category is a problem if that's all that people have, right? That they have to put themselves into this category, but then that all that people have, and they know that's their only opportunity, so they find ways to navigate it and to get themselves into that category. For sure, we see this materialize in all sorts of ways.
Thank you, Lucy. Sorry about the muddy question. I mean, but I think it's relevant because the way, I mean, kind of lay persons think about what is reproductive justice is always fighting about rights, kind of in the streets, as social movements and so forth. But when you put on the element of the category of deservingness, what does this type of justice look like on the ground? I think it's something that we could think about in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you.
Katie.
Thank you, Lucy. I think it sounds like a really interesting and important project, and I'm going to be fascinated to see what comes out of it, and especially some of the distinctions between Scotland and England, and what you said about Scottish hospitality and so on is really, really interesting, meaty stuff to get into. And I also really like the idea of what we can learn from doulaing, in ethnographic method, or I guess just in interactions with people more generally, even when we don't have our researcher hats on. I was thinking about the kind of third pillar, as it were, of reproductive justice, of the right to raise children in healthy environments, and how that comes up with the specific experiences of refugee and asylum-seeking women, and particularly in relation to, someone asked about social workers, and I was also wondering about sort of health visitors, and even just the first few weeks and months after a baby is born, how people are surveilled, are they treated differently, does it have any bearing on their housing situations, all that sort of stuff that comes after a child is born. But also you mentioned that you were going to not focus solely on women, which is great, and look at their broader kind of social and kin networks. So I just wondered, just maybe a bit more about what you're planning to do in relation to those themes.
Sorry, there's shouting about homework in the background now, so please ignore. The right to raise children in the ways that you deem appropriate and in healthy environments is a great point. There's been a big campaign over the summer about the accommodation that's provided, particularly to refugee mothers, and it's and just how inappropriate it is. And I mean that is the hostile environment in a nutshell, is this, providing the absolute bare minimum for someone to exist in the most challenging circumstances, and deem that sort of support or deem that care. And yeah, absolutely thinking about the role of health visitors, of community groups, of play groups, of, I mean, especially thinking about the last 18 months and thinking about what it's like to be a parent, living in those circumstances, living as someone who's actually a member of my external advisory board, recently finished her master's, and she'd done some research around how women who had been pregnant during COVID, and in the situation in Glasgow, had coped, and it was a lot of them talked about this heightened isolation, which you experience anyway as asylum seekers, but this really being exacerbated, and this anxiety of living in such cramped conditions where you're around so many other people and you're expected to take a bus to go to your antenatal appointments in a hospital, and this constant feeling of sort of isolation but also exposure and the threat of the virus. So yeah, certainly thinking like, and that's why I think it's important. It certainly has been my experience in Scotland that when people talk about migrant justice, they're really not talking about reproductive justice, right? Certainly not in the way that we see, definitely in the US, right, where it's that is, or in the Americas, I guess, where this is a much more prevalent framing. It's about deservingness, right? All these poor wee women. And so I think sort of trying to do this, have this discussion, this research kind of as a way of thinking more in terms of reproductive justice and things exactly like this, thinking about housing, thinking about the kind of ongoing lives beyond just pregnancy and birth. And then thinking about what I'm going to do, who I'm going to include, who I'm talking to. Katie, I'm going to talk to anybody who'll talk to me. Glasgow is, because it is this huge hub of this whole world that exists around kind of the presence of dispersed asylum seekers. There's a big refugee community, and a lot of the research that I've from across the UK that's been with asylum seekers and refugees is interviews, one-off interviews, and they don't capture that much about what else happens, about communities and about there's no ethnography, right? This is where I wished. So just trying to capture that by hanging out, going to these sort of community groups, going to mums groups, going to the park, going to dad's groups, going to, talking to whoever I will, but making sure that it captures more than what these interviews capture, because as useful as they are, they're often quite negatively structured. They want to find out about the problems with maternity care, and that's really important. But that's not the be-all and end-all of these people's lives or their experiences of reproduction, right? So it paints this picture that reproduction is a burden, and that it's terrible and it's awful and it shouldn't happen. But of course we know that reproduction is so much more than that. It can be, it can have its moments of greatness at the same time as it has its moments of horrendousness.
So Charlotte Waltz has a comment in the chat. She says, Elise Singer also writes about how pregnant people draw on their own moral categories of deservingness that are much more rooted in situational demands rather than political entitlements.
Yes, thanks.
So I don't know if people want to say any final comments. Thank you so much, Lucy, for joining our session today. I think this was a great conversation, not only because you showed us, you communicated a lot about your experience conducting research in the UK, in Scotland, and in Kenya, but also because you put interesting points about what reproductive justice means to people who are often kind of not really included in the picture. Our next session will be on January 19th, so next year, and we'll have Dr. Veronique Motier from the University of Cambridge, who will give a talk titled "What is Reproduction?", which I think will map into some of the interesting conversations we've had today. Thank you so much again, Lucy. This was a fantastic presentation, and I invite everybody to give a big virtual clap and to join us in our next events. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.